interview from the very beginning. And that question to start everything off with is just a simple, where are you from and where are you coming from?
I grew up in New Orleans in a pretty large family. There's 6 of us, and then had 90 of my kind of relatives on my father's side kind of scattered around the New Orleans area. So I joke that I grew up in organized chaos in the city. When I was growing up, the upbringing was really vibrant. I think one of the things that perhaps marked me the most as I was growing up with these kind of francophone, these kind of French-speaking influences in my life. So in my family, not everyone speaks French, but there's a kind of, there's always this gravitas, so to speak, around members of my family who do, and a lot of sort of matriarchs, especially my grand-mère's generation that I grew up with. So there was always this kind of influence in my family. And one of the formative aspects of growing up was I grew up in the sort of vertigo years after Katrina, as an entire generation did. And I think it was really a sort of a crucible for developing a lot of the worldview that I sort of developed over time, which is that we are connected, especially as a community, to the outside world. And when we are, I think that breeds a lot of resilience into the community. And I think it was really interesting to see in kind of after the hurricane, how a lot of those cultural influences came together and helped the city kind of rebuild. And it always had kind of an important impact. And so around that time, I started learning French and got the opportunity to practice with my father. And I also, as an adolescent, had the opportunity to start learning French Creole as well in the city.
From there, I read in your bio that you also had some experience living in France. So, and living in Paris specifically. So walk me through your journey of going from being in New Orleans to being in Paris, I think is where you were.
Exactly. So it's a circuitous route to a certain degree, but it was really neat what brought me here. I think I ended up doing my bachelor's degree in Virginia. I really enjoyed Virginia, but I kind of joked that it was my study abroad because the culture can be rather different up there. But I always was kind of, even during my studies there, I knew that there was this kind of francophone influence, and always just had this kind of itch to like want to be able to live in a majority French-speaking area. And so that kind of brought me to continue with my master's over here. So at the time I was graduating, I was debating about whether to work up, had the opportunity to work in DC or whether to continue with my with my studies. So I kind of decided that it would be a great opportunity, came over here to Paris and went to and studied political science for my master's degree at Sciences Po. So it was a really fascinating experience because the pedagogy and everything just shifted overnight. It's a very different system here. There's a lot of different expectations, and even if you speak French, I think that you learn and are kind of a little bit of a baptism by fire to a certain degree. So I had this wonderful experience, a very formative experience in which I was studying, but also learning and living over here in Paris.
When I think about political science, I do think that oftentimes it's very specific to how a country may teach political science. So when political science is taught in America, you learn it based on the American system, unless you're in international affairs. So I would assume that in Paris, you'll be learning it based on a French or European approach to politics. Tell me a little bit more about what it was like studying in Paris, like studying poli-sci, not in America, where you're more familiar with the political context, but in Europe and in France, which has a very different political culture compared to the United States.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think that the entire gravitation moves in a different way. I think what's interesting is in Paris, and specifically, there's a kind of continental European thought that just completely builds on the idea of just even the basis of political science, liberty, freedom. These ideas are built on a completely different way. That in the United States, for example, you may have this idea of being free from something, whereas in Europe, you're free to something. So that creates a completely different assumptions about what the government should provide, how you build and construct your society, and kind of the idea in France of solidarity being one of the really keystones of the modern kind of what they express as modern Republican virtues. So there's also a lot of different ideas and assumptions. It's been a lot of the debate in Europe and especially in France about, identities and are you French first, and how, maybe some of these debates around those types of identities are expressed very differently here. And it was really interesting to be in a classroom in which those were just taken for granted in ways that we take other assumptions to be granted in the United States. And it forces a reflection on those. And I think you can't quite walk away from the debate thinking the same way that you did before. And I think the other aspect of it, and this is what I had the opportunity to work after here as a consultant at Ernst & Young on the public sector for the European Union and for the French government. And I think what was really interesting was taking those perspectives politically and understanding, for example, the entire basis of the European Union on that and what they're trying to build with that project and why it works and what needs to be changed. I think it was a couple of very formative years to really put on hold a little bit or change to a certain degree my reflections about what I learned in the United States and completely compare them with another way of assuming about how the world should be structured or how things are or how people should be interacting.
I want to go back a little bit. What is the difference between a free from ideology, which is versus a free to ideology? What would be an example of that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the typical role of the government, this is kind of, it's a distilled down debate in this form, but I think it kind of emblematic of that would be if you're free from, for example, you would think that maybe the government would impede on certain rights of yours, so that you would say, I need to be free from the government restricting certain rights and they need to take a hands off. So you may you may kind of pinch towards a less government and those types of things that in the United States have been some of the cornerstones of the assumptions. But if you're in another context, you could also say, well, to achieve a certain right or be able to actually effectively live a certain right, concretely, there needs to be a certain set of enabling factors that makes that happen. And maybe the government should be involved in that process. So it's a really interesting thing because in Europe, you may have a heavier hand of like the social welfare state, for example, but that's completely in line with maybe the way that they think that they're exercising their individual right, their rights as a citizen of the nation in which they live. So I think it creates fascinating debates and there's all sorts of political interchange. And I think it's maybe a simpler way of expressing that debate, but I think some of the underlying ideas are seen a lot in the political thought on both sides of the Atlantic.
Did it have an influence on your own political thought? Because when I think about, the idea of travel, you're oftentimes changing your perspectives, you're seeing new things, you're seeing new ways of thinking, and you're kind of reconciling that with maybe your own point of view or how you were raised to think and see the world.
I think once you've seen other viewpoints and you realize that every human being is just working, they're working with a certain set of parameters and they're thinking about these issues in the same way that we are, in the United States, for example, I think it's hard to close the door. I think that after it's hard to look inward in any way. I think it's informed a lot of the professional projects that I've worked on after is it's about opening up. It's about whether it's in Louisiana, thinking about francophone culture and creolophone culture as a way to be able to think about these issues and like how they connect us to the broader world. I think that's really been influential in terms of the way that I'm thinking about these topics.
Yeah, I feel the same way about my own experiences because I've had a chance to travel not just to other parts of the world, but also other parts of America. And it's given me an opportunity to change how I see myself and also how I navigate the world that I live in. For example, when I lived up north, I realized how valuable my identity as a Southerner was compared to when I was living in Louisiana and kind of was a little bit ashamed about it. But living in another part of the country made me realize that there is some value to where I'm from and where I come from in my own identity. And that even within a culture, I have my own subculture within that. So I think that traveling can definitely do that for you. And it can also help you to understand yourself and where you fit in very much so.
Great reflection. And I think you're absolutely right about that. And I think it's funny how, I guess it's the avoiding a singular narrative, right? Like the South is X, without recognizing all of the progress that's been made, and to a certain degree, you have Stacey Abrams and all these types of advocacy and this kind of political dynamism that hasn't been seen in the United States in quite a while. So I think that when you think about these issues, it's just, I guess, avoiding any narrative about any place as being such helps you kind of think about and helps humanize that place, and I think it also helps come to the conclusion that these places are changing and they're dynamic and that you should never write off any place. And I think that that's what travel, that's what being kind of forced into another education system does, because you have to reevaluate what your assumptions are underneath, and you have to, it forces you to reflect on where you're from.
you did mention that you worked for EY France as a public sector consultant, and I didn't want to, brush that off completely. So I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your experience working with them, and what were some projects that you had a chance to work on and get involved in while you were working with them.
Yeah, I mean, it was a cool experience. I mean, it was a little rigorous because we'll probably talk about that. We're kind of working in parallel on some projects for Louisiana to join the Francophonie. So there's kind of a little bit of a fraught period with a lot of activity going on. But it was cool because I had this really interesting opportunity as an American to be able to work on projects that were very in the kind of weeds about the European Union. And I thought it was really neat because you realize that the procedures that they go through, the way that their entire way of getting public policy out the door is very different than the way that we do it in the United States. The institutions are different, the people that have to be consulted are different. And even the idea of each project having like a public consultation, so it has to be subject to having people's input from anywhere in the EU. I mean, some really interesting ways that they go about it. And then you have to kind of shift your mentality to a certain degree. Okay, we need to adopt these procedures and make sure that we include them in the way that we're doing our reports. So specifically what I was doing was working on evaluation. So we would look at the public policy of the European Union or French government policy, offer kind of a judgment using kind of different criteria about the success of those public policies. So it was really fascinating because how do you measure the success, and what countries are you measuring the success? How do you create a standard measure for success, understanding that Cyprus is incredibly different from Ireland? It was a really fascinating period to be thinking about these types of questions. And I think in terms of putting into practice a little bit of what I had been learning in terms of poli-sci for a while.
What was your favorite project to work on while you were with EY France? Like, what was that thing that even today you're like, wow, that was so cool. I can't believe I did that.
Well, I had this really cool project where we were working on helping improve the communication strategy of the European Union, and specifically on like of the representations that they have in their member states. So they have kind of like embassies almost, but in each to just kind of not coordinate policy, but just kind of build visibility for the European Union and organize programs. So we did like an evaluation of their communication strategy, and it allowed me to just travel all around Europe and be able to go and talk to different talk with different constituencies and different countries and get their feedback about the programs that were being designed, and just an entire process of consulting different publics to understand what can public policy do, or what type of programs can they do that build that confidence between EU citizens and the European Union, and helping bridge that gap. And I thought it was a really hands-on way to recognizing a really underlying problem which came out of the financial crisis in 2008, which was the EU was sort of seen as a boogeyman for the financial woes that happened, and there's all sorts of discussions around that, but they wanted to help repair that image. And I think that the programs that they were doing were really interesting to be able to sit down with people and go, so what's the problem? How do we fix it? And what types of activities can we do in terms of public awareness and engagement that would help bridge that gap? So going to the member states, sitting down, writing that report was a really cool, it was just a really fascinating time. And I thought it has echoes in what's going on in the United States today. I think feelings of trust, feelings of camaraderie, feelings of solidarity are really prevalent issues. And I think thinking about ways that we can build public consultation and just having a multitude of different actors expressing their opinions rather than it be narrowly channeled is an incredibly important, I think, exercise for the United States to be thinking about as well. I think that there's always a give and take, and any type of democratic institutions should always be looking at each other to think about what can be done better.
I think I heard something recently that said that democracy is literally government by the people and for the people. So when you're doing anything that involves collaboration, you're always wanting to improve and be better and not get too complacent. And I think that's probably an issue that many governments across the world face, and many democracies, is that they get complacent instead of consistently finding ways to nurture their democracies and expand it to more and more people. So I really appreciated what you said. Like, we do need to focus more on collaboration and really trying to find ways to get people to see the importance of democracy, because I'm not sure when the timeline for you working on this project with France, but I do know that the European Union has been really hustling a lot in the last couple of years to establish itself as a as an entity that is strong and united in the midst of so many political setbacks, from Brexit to a lot of different authoritarian countries that have kind of, sprung up in Europe itself. I think of Hungary, I think of Poland, and the European Union is trying to, hold down the fort and hold the line, but it's very difficult to do so when democracy in many of these countries is becoming increasingly fragile. And and it's rich for me to say that, because even democracy in America is kind of fragile.
Well, it's always, it's an interesting reflection. I mean, it was things we took for granted, assumptions we made about, how stable institutions are. They go through the ringer, and sometimes not as solid as we think. I think that's important. I mean, I think, but there's different approaches you could take to those questions, right? One could be that no, it'll be okay, but like, I don't know, I don't think that's ever the right answer. No generation has ever said it's going to be okay, and just kind of like let everything in motion, and it stands up straight after. I think that the reality is sometimes you just got to embrace the problem to a certain degree. Like the EU does realize, I mean, they've just kind of been drinking from the fire hose of political troubles, whether it's just dealing with illiberal democracy, right? Or dealing with a giant, one of your biggest member states leaving. But part of the reframing, and it's not always perfect, but it's saying, fine, then we will become a democratic world. I mean, we have certain values we do. And it kind of, what's interesting is rather than run away and kind of fracture, at least on some of these issues, there seems to be this kind of understanding that like, they kind of refound their raison d'etre, their kind of reason for working together. And I think it's really interesting to watch that.
The attitude is, it's not right, but it's okay. We're going to make it.
We're going to make it, but they've seen worse. We've also, every place has seen worse. It just, there has to be kind of proactive.
I was actually going to ask you about, that whole process of getting Louisiana to be a part of the Francophonie, and then kind of also talk about what led to the NOUS Foundation. And it's a lot of questions, so I'm going to take it step by step, because I want to kind of slowly walk into NOUS. But the first question I want to ask is, before you talk about why and how you got Louisiana to be a part of the Francophonie, I want you to explain what exactly La Francophonie is, for a lot of people who may not be too familiar with French culture and French language in the French-speaking world.
Yeah, so in French, it's the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie. It goes by the OIF as an acronym. That's the International Organization of the Francophonie. So it's often abbreviated as La Francophonie. So anytime I refer to La Francophonie, it's in reference to this organization, or just kind of the entity of French-speaking regions and countries. But it was founded in 1970. It's a regrouping of all the different kind of a lot of different French-speaking, either French-speaking countries at the time, or Francophile, or places in which French was very prevalent. So you have a lot of countries in Western Europe, and Africa, in Canada, Quebec, these types of entities that have joined it. And today, it's the second largest international organization behind the UN. It includes 88 countries and regions, 16% of the global GDP, and 1 billion people. So it's a very large institution. And a lot of their advocacy works on cultural cooperation, reinforcing some democratic ideals and values, kind of gender equality is a big element to it. But also there's kind of economic and technical cooperation as well. So there's some mobility programs and different trade forums that they organize. So the institute's based in, I mean, the OIF is based in Paris, but they have antennas and all over the world, and different kind of like educational ministries and kind of different things that they've established in different countries. It's a large entity. It's literally on every continent except Antarctica, I suppose. But it's a really fascinating organization.
How did you get Louisiana to be a part of the Francophonie? I mean, it's only natural because of our history, and we were a French colony at some point. But to be a part of the Francophonie, I think that's pretty significant. So tell me about how you got that, how you made that happen.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just kind of roll back for Louisiana. What's interesting about Louisiana, of course, there's this colonial legacy and this kind of history about that. And I think what's interesting that we don't think about in Louisiana quite often is how, for literally the entire 19th century into the 20th century, I mean, plurality, at least of our state and our region, spoke French or Louisiana Creole. and that these languages developed, these cultures developed, and a lot of the hallmarks of our culture, whether it's the architecture, the music, or or jazz, example, in all sorts of elements of our culture are sort of tangible legacies and sort of evidence that these cultures have been evolving. So as recently as 1970, the state had 1 million French speakers, which is pretty hard to believe. We're down to around an estimated 200,000, so that it's been a precipitous decline. But I think there's a recognition, especially internationally, that this culture and these cultures have exist in Louisiana, and we have this sort of very important legacy kind of baked into our state's DNA almost. And I think what's really important, I had this opportunity while I was at Sciences Po in Paris at the time. So this was in when I came in 2015, and by 2016, I had the opportunity to go to an economic forum on the Francophonie, and I was like, this is kind of interesting, like there's a lot of countries, a lot of regions here. Quebec, for example, had a different Quebec, New Brunswick, Ontario had a different status from Canada, and that's in a federal structure. So it kind of began this process starting in 2016. This is where I had the opportunity to meet the co-founder of NOUS, Rudy Bazinet, and we started really working on just initially proposing the idea, and then it kind of became this kind of avalanche towards adhesion, having Louisiana join, to sit there and go, maybe it would be possible for Louisiana. So it became this circuitous route, but we working with a lot of different stakeholders in government and also community stakeholders. But we were able to basically get special permit via our Senate delegation, get special permission for Louisiana to be able to apply, put together our dossier, our kind of application by 2018. And then from there, all of the at that time, it was, I think 84, all of the members of the Francophonie voted unanimously to allow Louisiana into this organization. So I think it's a real big recognition. I think it was, to a certain degree, a crowning achievement of sitting there going, there's this recognition internationally that Louisiana is part of the Francophonie, and that even if it wasn't necessarily official before, we weren't officially part of the Francophonie, to a certain degree, we have always been a part of the Francophonie. And I think it's up to our communities, and especially in civil society today, to really take advantage of this, because I think we've gone through a lot of, I think Louisiana especially, I mean, as all communities have with COVID, a lot of these different, challenges have maybe accelerated some of the underlying problems that we face as a community, whether it's inequality or a lack of opportunities for underserved communities. And I think one of the things that maybe the Francophonie and rethinking about these issues is that we have this incredibly rich culture. We have these languages that are not foreign languages, they are heritage languages. And we have communities that we can maybe better serve if we are developing mobility programs in different kind of, thinking about these issues proactively. And so that's what really, when Rudy and I think during the OIF initiative, having Louisiana join the Francophonie, we just realized there is so much activity on the ground. So that's kind of what had us want to set up the NOUS Foundation. So we go by the little pseudonym NOLA. We wanted to set it up to help to work with different partners in Louisiana, and because there's a lot of grassroots organization, but sit there and go, we want to provide you with financial resources, we want to provide you with capacity building resources, and we want to be putting you in touch with organizations, whether they're in Quebec, France, West Africa, Senegal, for example, and be thinking about how we could be designing programs that actually reinforce the desire to speak French in Louisiana, but also desire for Louisianans to go to the Francophonie, so that people are thinking about Louisiana as a sort of pole inside of the Francophonie in the way that we think about other places.
What specifically does the NOUS Foundation do? Like, what are some examples of projects and activities that you all work on? Because I think that it's really awesome that you all have this desire to connect Louisiana back to its French culture and its heritage, and to also connect it to the rest of the world. And I just wonder, what does that look like every day, or what does that look like in terms of projects and programs and things like that?
Yeah, without wanting to sound like too corporate, I guess, but we design our mission around 3 ideas. One is so the idea of like promoting and the idea of like promoting French and Creole speaking cultures in Louisiana is really built around, we've done a bunch of different programs. One would be, we do a lot of what's called New and You, and it's like building interviews out, speaking with people who have been able to integrate French and Louisiana Creole into parts of their professional careers, or how they came about it, or how even just their path to relearning languages. and really a human kind of story just to say that these are real people that you live next to who are speaking these languages. So the interview campaign's been one of them. We've done a really neat collaboration with the University of Cambridge on specifically promoting Louisiana Creole. So we did one on the revitalization efforts of Louisiana Creole, kind of a retrospective, speaking with kind of different actors from Louisiana Creole community who have been working on language advocacy for the last decades. And so we had a really constructive conversation, and we had hundreds of people attend. We were relatively surprised by the kind of the buzz that generated, and also the follow-on conversations. And it's really helped kind of reinforce the dialogue that was already there. We've also been just developing partnerships. We, for example, this is kind of gets to a point about connect as being one of our values, is developing partnerships so that projects are being done between Louisiana and Quebec, for example, between Louisiana and France, between Louisiana and Senegal, any countries that we can help reinforce those ties. And an example of that would be that we became one of the founding members, one of the only 2 institutions in the United States, it's the International Network of Francophone Institutions, or the Francophone houses. And what that allows is that we have a partnership with 54 institutions around the world. So if you want to develop a project in Vietnam, with Francophone populations in Vietnam, someone could contact us and we could help develop a project at distance. If we want to develop it in Togo, whatever, any country, we have kind of these partner institutions that we can work with. And I think it really helps put Louisiana on the map in that way, that we have these kind of institutions that we know that we can kind of be collaborating with on. And the other element is just an exchange of practice. I mean, I think that a lot of different programs are going on around the world, and all these organizations are designing their own programs. So they also want to be reaching out to us, because a lot of people are curious about what the minority Francophone communities in North America looks like, and how do you protect these languages, because a lot of people are in communities that are similar position, that they may be a Francophone community in a minority context. So the exchange of practice is incredibly important.
What have been some challenges that you all have faced in doing this work?
There's 3 that immediately come to mind. I think one is just visibility. It's just, there's a lot of people kind of deride Francophone and Creolophone Louisiana by saying it kind of belongs to some sort of folkloric past, and that is definitely reinforced in sort of mainstream media about these cultures. And I think it really undercuts the dynamism and all the community activism that's going on, and also just the projects. I mean, we all live today. I think that it's important to be thinking that there is this dynamism, and I think making sure that people understand that, and that these cultures are always developing, they're always in evolution, and that there's no kind of like static entity, static Creolophone Louisiana that either we're trying to revert to, or that, because it never really, to a certain degree, it never really existed. There were times in which there were more Francophones, more Creolophones, and maybe it was more obvious that those cultures were present. But the culture it doesn't disappear, it just changes. And also so we're all evolving in kind of to an Anglophone context. And I think also just sitting there today going, no, we still exist. We're 300 years into this saga, we're still here, and just like there was a precipitous decline throughout the 20th century, but it can also be built back up. You know what I mean? There's no reason to be defeated. There's no reason to be kind of nostalgic per se about it, because if you play your cards correctly, then you don't have to be nostalgic, because the future that you're building will be all the better, So I think that's one element to it that's always really important. I think the second one is at maybe a policy level. I think that there's sometimes the propensity of different actors to want to exercise a lot of control without recognizing the importance that civil society plays in moving the dial. And I think that some of the policies to promote French have been very successful. I think that they should be lauded and really understood. And some of the policies have been less successful. And I think that maybe we should have a constructive debate about maybe which programs, which services would actually correspond to the needs of our communities, and which services maybe benefit a certain group of people, but may not really benefit the community as a whole. And also making sure what we were talking about earlier about are we really integrating the feedback from all of the communities? or are we just favoring certain narratives or certain voices? Because it creates an echo chamber that I think kind of, it's almost like playing the lyre while Rome burns. You know what I mean? It sounds very nice, but there's something much more important going on around you. And I think we need to be thinking about that in the context of Francophone and Creole Louisiana, that the communities that have held on to these languages need to be heard, because it's their ability to transmit it to a new generation that will be incredibly determinant about where we will be by 2050. And I think that that's the perspective that we need to be thinking about. And I think the more we can diversify our programs, the more that we can be developing programs in which people feel empowered to want to talk, like, and don't have someone just kind of yelling at them, then I think it is much more likely that those voices will be heard. And I think it may even shift the way we think about these debates, because there's so many different ways to think about these issues. And then I guess the third one is that we're talking about small communities. You know what I mean? It's just like, we're in South Louisiana, we're talking about small communities. And I think one of the things that have been always thorny in Louisiana, and this is true anywhere, is that the idea of identity is incredibly personal. And I think sometimes the propensity that people have is to tell people what they're identifying as is wrong. And I think that may not be the most constructive way to approach the debate. I think the reality is maybe what would be more empowering is to say, we understand that you identify that way, and we validate, and that's your personal, the way that you identify is deeply personal, and we will provide a whole cornucopia of resources that, as you read and you digest and you live with this culture, and maybe you even come back to learning the language, that's going to be something that you can kind of think about. And I think that may change the way that you think about your own identity, because I think in that way, just something as simple as, if you're thinking about these identities, but you may not speak the language, it makes even English may not even give you the right set of words to be able to think about these things in the way that you would think about them in the languages that they originally were kind of conceptualized in. So I think it's really important to provide those resources and just meet people where they are.
So I'm thinking about the fact that a lot of the French culture and heritage of Louisiana cannot be divorced from this history of race and racism in Louisiana and the United States, because during the 20th century, you see a lot of the waspification of like American culture, where people are becoming more embracing of like white Anglo-Saxon Protestant values. And so anything that is, aside from that, tended to be very much, looked down upon. Think about the fact that JFK got a lot of flack for being Catholic, and a lot of the French Louisiana culture is rooted in Catholicism. And also the fact that people who spoke French were almost forbidden and penalized for speaking French. And so when you get these legal consequences to demonstrating and practicing culture, then you're less likely to pass it down, because it's no longer safe or legal for you to do so. And I'm also just thinking about the fact that cultural exchange itself is often seen as a very elitist thing. It's like, when you think of cultural exchange, you think of, $1,000 plane tickets, a passport, which a lot of people don't have. And typically travel is not always accessible to everyday people. And so when you frame travel as the only way you can experience culture, it tends to be framed from this white middle class or white upper class activity. And so a lot of people who would benefit from cultural exchange feel shut out, because they're like, well, learning a language, that seems kind of niche, it seems like something that only rich people do, or only, I hate to be this way, but white people do. And it tends to, and what I often find is that a lot of cultural exchange organizations don't take the time to do this like outreach to diverse communities. And it tends to only be something that white, middle, and upper class people participate in. And that was one of the things I experienced a lot when I was, at university and involved with a lot of international education work with my background, that I was the only Black person everywhere I was, or there were just not a lot of people of color or people from working class backgrounds of any race who were participating in these kind of cultural exchange activities.
I think it brings up a lot of important points. And I think that experience is really, it resonates with a lot of people. I think a lot of people have lived similar experience and understand that to be the dynamic. And I think it brings up, I guess, a couple of different things in Louisiana in terms of the question of accessibility is critical. If we're going to do something new with language revitalization, we have to make a convincing case about how this will change underlying deeply rooted inequalities, and that these cultures are not divorced from them. It's not just because we speak another language that, a heritage language in Louisiana that's not English, that it doesn't come with a whole panoply of its own assumptions. And I think if you look back to Louisiana's history, we practiced kind of a pigmentocracy throughout much of the 18th and 19th century, this kind of degrade, basically pinning people's relative, their rights based on their relative kind of the perception of their blackness or their whiteness in that case. And I think that that's an important history to understand because it has echoes to modern deep-rooted problems in Louisiana. And I think one of the things that is important about how we reframe this narrative today is to sit there and go, we recognize that these inequalities existed, that they're also reinforced sometimes by these cultures or maybe rooted in these cultures. But we do have an opportunity today to maybe expand access. Maybe bilingual education could bring a new way of thinking about education in a way that could be more accessible to underserved communities, in a way that maybe public education has really, that certain forms of public education have underserved over the years. And that, or maybe for an accessibility program, which is one of the things that we're really working on through NOUS, is to sit there and go, how can you go into communities that may not have necessarily exactly what you're saying, a passport to be able to travel, to be able to take 5 months out of their lives and just go to Paris or go to Montreal, or, and how do you develop a partnership with an institution elsewhere so that you can send the individual there, they can go back to their community and become a community advocate for those languages. And I think that those are the types of critical programs that will be important for the transmission of the language long term, but also working with other places to get their scholars, to get their thought leaders, to get their community activists to Louisiana so that we can be thinking about other forms of organization, because we can't send everyone abroad, but we can bring people. And if you just get one advocate from abroad to come to one town or city in Louisiana, you can have a touch point of literally hundreds of thousands of people, and that can maybe literally revolutionize or change the way that they think about their heritage languages and their relationship to their cultures. And I think that's going to be very important. I think that sort of what we were talking about at the beginning of this, of this discussion, is that kind of democratization, that kind of public consultation, that really going back to the root of like, if we know what the problems are for French, we know that there's a history of political violence against that kind of banned French for literally, for decades. We know that there was a kind of dismantling of the Reconstruction government, and that created a sort of a whole slippage into segregation and all these types of this entirely very violent and kind of sad, very difficult history. And we need to recognize that if we can make the link between these challenges that, in the violence enacted on these communities, there may be a chance today to rectify to a certain degree what the root causes of those are, or at least, even if we can't solve it overnight, because this will take decades, centuries to really untangle, maybe we can move ourselves in a different direction. Maybe, and it's for that same reason. Once you start thinking in another language, once you start thinking about your history differently, it's hard to be closed-minded again. It's just you've opened someone up. It's really hard for them to go back in. So I think that that's really something we need to be, maybe that's really the opportunity for promoting language revitalization in these cultures in Louisiana.
I also wanted to ask, a couple of wrap-up questions about the NOUS Foundation and just this idea of cultural exchange. And the first question I have is relevant to the impact that the pandemic has on a positive way of helping you to rethink this idea of cultural exchange. Because as you said, not everybody can travel for months or weeks to another country and experience another part of the world. But no matter how much money you have, you can't do that anyway right now. So what I'm finding is that a lot of different organizations are finding new ways to do cultural exchange and to completely rethink, how they engage with the cultures. So what role do you think the pandemic has played in helping the NOUS Foundation rethink how it's going to promote not only cultural exchange in terms of Francophone culture and the Francophone world, but just cultural exchange in general? Like, what are some new ideas that you all have been able to come up with to kind of go around the pandemic?
The gravity of the pandemic is, self-evident. I think, although it created a sort of a weird kind of counter, situation in which through quarantines and curfews, you actually have a lot more time to rethink kind of as we were getting our project off the ground, we quarantine. So like we had this kind of like moment of like deep reflection about what are we doing, how are we doing it, how are we adapting to the circumstances around us to make sure that we respond to the needs of the community around us, because the needs are changing in real time. And I think in terms of cultural exchange, I think there's maybe a couple different aspects. One is that you're able to engage a much larger community this way. And I think maybe what's evident about that is that when we were working on these conferences recently, maybe if we had been just based in New Orleans and had done a physical event in New Orleans, then you would not have had Louisiana Creoles out in Chicago participating, out in Salt Lake City participating. It would have really limited that voice in a way that I think would have been maybe made the debate less rich, or maybe not have created the same links and discussions that are happening today, so that it broadened the debate. And I think that type of cultural exchange is that a recognition that diaspora communities exist inside the United States too, that people may have roots in South Louisiana, live elsewhere. The other one is just that a recognition that a lot of people are looking at what we're doing in Louisiana. Quite frankly, what we pulled off with the Francophonie, what we're doing with our foundation is generating buzz. And I think what's been really interesting about switching some of our work to social media is that you see that there are literally thousands of people looking at what we're doing. And that may be something that would have been perceived as a niche, like, oh, well, is there enough of a population that cares? Is there, that kind of visibility question we were talking about earlier? The interesting part about it is when you kind of switch maybe some of your activities to social media, and suddenly there are 6,000 people around the world looking and interacting with your content, you just realize it's like, okay, no, we're barking up the right tree. Like we are. The people care, people are interested, they're in Louisiana, they're in countries all around the world, and that people implicitly know that Louisiana is a pole of the Francophonie, and they think of that of us that way, and we should leverage that. And I think that that's another element to it that may be a bizarre side effect of cultural exchange, is that you realize when you're less focused on the day-to-day about how you're interacting with each person, just in kind of physical interactions, you start paying more attention about maybe online about how people in other countries and other regions are looking at you. And I think that that's really important to leverage and think about. And then the last part is just maybe the programs that we're designing have had to switch a little bit. And by that, I mean that one of the things that we've thought about is, like, in a period of intense introspection, what are some of the programs that we can design that just help people get out of the mental barriers that are stopping them from learning the language? Because I think there's a moment right now where a lot of people are just rethinking a lot of aspects of their lives. So we launched a program, for example, called Moi, Nous. And so the idea of me, us, the me is typically something that is really a barrier to your learning French. Well, do people speak French? Oh, well, should I learn another language? Well, I don't have time. And the new kind of idea of like this kind of community conscience is like, no, this is like, if you do this in kind of a fun way, you can overcome it, because a lot of people are thinking about the same issues that you're thinking about. And I think that that kind of is an impact of COVID on our messaging, because we started thinking more about people are isolated right now, people are scared right now. So what are some of the ways that we can communicate on this culture that people really do feel passionate about in a way that makes them find community, that makes them see themselves in the messaging that we're doing? And I think that that's going to be I think that that's one of the other aspects of it.
I do feel like the pandemic has definitely given a lot of organizations challenges to work through, but also a lot of opportunities for growth. I mean, even my organization, I have that same, possibility and opportunity because of the pandemic to make my work and the work of my organization a lot less centered in one community, where sometimes there's a lot of things going on in that community where people don't actually get to see your work. Whereas when you cast a wider net, you get to attract more people. And I've spoken to a lot of people throughout the interview series and also outside of the interview series, just in passing, about how a lot of stuff in Louisiana is based off of this concept of artificial value, where it's like people will be attracted to something when they think that it's a lot more valuable than it actually is. And while it doesn't mean that everything that has a lot of value hype isn't really worth your time, it's more so to say that sometimes you need to bring the outside in to get the inside in first. So it's kind of afterwards. Well, let me repeat that. More so you get the people outside of your community to uplift you, so that way the people that are in your community can see that it's worth investing in. Because what I found is that, okay, maybe if we get people outside of our community to kind of build our organization and build our network, then the people inside of the community will be like, wow, they're here and they're doing this, they've done this, they have this. Well, let's see what they have going on. You know, it's a very interesting way of outreach, but it's also one that not only helps you to accomplish your goals, but it also helps the community to see that there are people who really love what's going on in Louisiana. They like the type of work that we're doing. They like the justice work, the cultural exchange work. So if everybody else loves it, then we need to show a little bit of love for ourselves and you know, show some support as well.
Completely agreed. No, it's a really great point. And I think we're all navigating a really tough time right now. So, I mean, cutting ourselves a little slack and just saying we're doing the best we can is, you know, with really limited resources is really important for any association, any group, any nonprofit, any group in Louisiana. Everyone's just trying to make way with it. But I think what's funny is what you're mentioning is true, because I mean, it's like if you're in a store and you're looking at something and then someone comes up and picks up that item, suddenly that item becomes a lot more attractive. You know, like you know, it's like, oh, I should have gotten it. You know, I think what's funny in Louisiana, there's so many people advocating for culture. There's so many people really tackling some of the deepest problems that we have, and a lot of that work is, I mean, it's tireless. I think sometimes what happens though is like when people look at what you're doing externally and they're validating that and they're saying, this is so cool, this is amazing. It makes everyone kind of, people that may not be involved in those spaces suddenly kind of perk up and be, oh, cool, okay, yeah, this is great. You know, this is part of my life now. And I think that that's exactly how you build buy-in. You know, I think that that's, you know, it's a really nice, I think that that's a great, you know, maybe a great impact. And it's just a reality. I think people do love Louisiana. It's a complicated place. It's hard to live in sometimes, you know, but there is something about there. I think I always joke that, you know, Louisiana is as much a lifestyle as it is a place, you know what I mean? And there's something undeniable about it.
Honestly, at one point in my life, one of those people were about a decade ago, I was like, I am leaving Louisiana when I graduate high school and I'm never coming back. But then the last decade being at UNO and being away from home helped me to realize that Louisiana is a place that just needs a little bit of love and just needs a little bit of, it's kind of like that person that always is made to feel like they're ugly or they're unattractive, and they just need more people to tell them that no, you are attractive. No, you are like all these different things. And I think that Louisiana, having gone through the challenges that it's gone through in this century, you know, with Katrina and all the other things that we've dealt with, also keeping in mind that Louisiana is a southern state and the South constantly gets kind of ratted on and overlooked by other parts of the country. You know, I just think that Louisiana is a state that we just need to show a little bit more love to. And as we begin to show love for it, then we begin to love ourselves and our community enough to want better for it. And that often will mean making sure that Louisiana is connected to the rest of the world. And we're not just seen as this isolated, you know, funky place any other time that doesn't involve Mardi Gras and Jazz Fest, you know, or football season. You know, we actually do have a lot of value in things like that. I'm sure that having the experiences you've had, you've probably done interviews after interview, and you've always left an interview with this feeling of, oh my God, I should have said this. Oh my God, I should have said that. You know, or man, I wish I got a chance to talk about this. And I don't want you to leave the interview feeling that way, because this is about your work and your story and your journey. And I feel like I wouldn't be doing a good job if I ended this interview and then you left it like, I didn't get a chance to talk about this. I really didn't get a chance to talk about this. I really didn't want to get a chance to get a little bit deeper about this. So if you want to, what are some things that you'd like to express or share that you didn't have a chance to do so during the course of the interview, or maybe some final words that you wanted to share with those who may be watching this, you know, before we wrap it up?
Two things come to mind. One is that while we are talking about Francophone and Creole from Louisiana, we're talking about these dynamic cultures, and it's that the door is open, you know what I mean? In the sense that I would love to see, I think what part about bringing Louisiana and bringing opportunities to the state in the future, building on this kind of idea of bilingualism and really reinforcing some of these cultures, is also, I would love someone from Chicago to be able to move to New Orleans or move to Lafayette, wherever they want to move in the state, recognize, be attracted to this culture and feel like they can become a part of it too, you know, and understand that there's a space for them in these cultures. So I think that that's important, that we're not talking about anything that's really communitarian. It's like they are communities, but it's also a broader culture, and that culture is shared, and that culture has always shaped Louisiana in a way that has been for Anglophones and Francophones and Creolophones. And I think that's one of the elements. So that if anyone wants to get involved with NOUS and what we're doing as a movement in this kind of activism, there is no. It's like the answer is always yes, and you are always welcome to the table, and you should always speak up. And that no matter if you don't have to speak French, you do not have to speak Louisiana Creole. You can always be involved. And that gets back to what we want to do with NOUS is like, we do want to create a cultural institute in New Orleans. We want to have physical spaces where people can practice these language and speak it and understand. And I think that's our long-term ambition. I think we will be working online, working and adapting with COVID, and working, but I think our long-term end goal is to develop and really be working on projects in a physical space that we as all Louisianians can all go to and really understand that's, while this is oriented around Francophone and Creolophone culture, it's oriented towards Louisianans and anyone in America or international who would like to be in that space.
I definitely feel like one of the ways to fulfill some of the ask is collaboration. There are a lot of people doing work in the community. Some of it intersects, some of it is more parallel. But I've spoken to a lot of people throughout the series, and they all talk about this idea of collaboration as a way to get their work out there and to expand their work. And I think that creating a stronger community network of Louisiana-based organizations and Southeast Louisiana-based organizations, will definitely help to promote everybody's cause, because all of our work intersects. I see, this cultural exchange work intersecting with a lot of social justice work, because when you get people to understand the social issues in the culture and the socio-political reasons why certain cultures are devalued or valued more than others, then we can begin to have a much more robust conversation on what does cultural exchange really mean, and also making sure that when we're collaborating, we're always surrounded by fresh perspectives that can enhance and revitalize our work. And anytime we're getting to a point where things are kind of not going so hot, or we may be, kind of losing our steam. And also, my last question is, how can we support you? How can we, help the NOUS Foundation, both I as an individual and also 821?
One element is get involved, reach out to us. If you want to design a program, if you're interested in a project, you just want to offer your input on any things that we're publishing or working on or conferences, then just reach out to us. It's bonjour, BONJUR @newnola.org. So anytime anyone wants to reach out to us, please do. And the other element to it is just, we are a 501c3 organization. We do take in donations. So if this is kind of exactly. If this is a project that you would like to kind of support, we also, we develop programs and the money that goes into those programs. So it's those are types of advocacy and ways that people can get involved. But I also want to stress that if someone is just interested more broadly in the movement, they can use NOUS as like a relay point. We are happy to also put them in touch with other organizations. There's all sorts of organizations in Louisiana developing right now around these questions. So we're not going to monopolize the conversation. We want people to reach out to us, and then we'll put them in touch with other people who may have like-minded issues that they care about. So I think that what you were talking about earlier is very important, and it's maybe to wrap up the conversation where we started. One of the elements that is interesting, and maybe one of the things we can almost appreciate more, is that like in France and a lot of the kind of Francophone mindset, which is interesting because it's also been seen in Louisiana back in the day, is the idea of solidarity is very, very strong in the French language. And I think that I think in Louisiana, maybe that's part of what we need. We need compassion, but we also just need solidarity, that we're all in it together, and that there's this kind of certain responsibilities we have to each other as a community that should be built on these kinds of principles, that we're, at the end of the day, we're all neighbors. And whether it's the coast that's going to, that's kind of unwinding Louisiana like a thread, or the social justice issues that have just been deep rooted in our culture, we all have to live in the same community. We all want to see that community survive to see tomorrow. So we need to be, we need solidarity.
Thank you so much, Scott, for taking the time to speak to me and to be a part of the Expanding Our Roots interview series. That you were able to, talk about this amazing organization and the type of work that you do. And I look forward to being a part of the NOUS Foundation and collaborating with y'all and doing some cool things that will help to show people the value of our French heritage in Louisiana, and also just the idea of cultural exchange. expanding our roots means you expand who you are and where you're from. You share all those things that make you you with the rest of the world, and to build those connections. So yeah.
Totally agree. Now we look forward to working together.